Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to wait for the numbers to stabilize for just a second. Seems like the number of participants joining is slowing down, but we'll give it just a minute and then we'll go ahead and dive in. Okay. Things seem like they're stabilizing in terms of the number of participants. So let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is John Carlson. I'm a senior financial grant specialist at the Colorado Broadband office. I'm going to kick us off today. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into BABA, which is the Build America, Buy America Act. It's going to be pretty content heavy. So I'm going to keep the introduction brief. Before we dive into the content, though, we have just a couple of housekeeping items. If we could go to the next slide, please. A couple things we wanted to talk about. I'm going to talk about letter of credit really quickly, and then I'll hand it over to my colleague Kyle to give us a reminder about the technical assistance program. But first, on the letter of credit, one of the things that we're concerned about is misunderstandings about what's required for the letter of credit. So just to be clear, the letter of credit and what we need, it's not just the completed letter of credit template. It would be better to think about it as a letter of credit package that we need to receive from the applicants. So there is the template itself, but there's also a certification that we will need, depending on the financial institution, an evidentiary document, an opinion letter from legal counsel. Again, it's not just the template, and we don't want folks to be confused about what we're looking for there. This could cause a few weeks delays, and of course, we're moving as quickly as we can. So if you have questions or if you're not sure what you gave us or what you're putting together is in compliance, please take a look at the BEAD onboarding guide. That's located on our BEAD landing page. I'll see if I can't put a link in the chat here shortly. And that also the applicable regulation 47 CFR 54.804. Please reference both of those resources and make sure that your letter of credit package is in compliance with those two things. All right, so I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague Kyle, who's going to give us a reminder about the Cybersecurity Technical Assistance Program. Kyle, over to you.
Thanks, John. Hey, everyone. Good afternoon. Just wanted to remind everyone that the CBO provides a cybersecurity and supply chain risk management technical assistance program. As part of finalizing a BEAD grant agreement, it is a prerequisite that the grantee provide a certification that you are in compliance with the federal regulations with respect to cybersecurity and supply chain risk management. We have secured some contractors who can assist with this program. So if you would like us to execute some task orders to help give you a level of confidence before you sign that certification, our team can provide that assistance to you. Also, we have additional task orders that we can activate that can help you get in compliance prior to signing that certification. So I provide the link here to our website. If you have any questions, check out the website to apply or contact myself or John Carlson. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. Okay, so that's it from us for now on housekeeping items. Now we're going to turn it over to our colleagues, Naveed and Anthony, who are going to take us through this deep dive on BABA.
Sounds great. We can go to the next slide. Yep. So good afternoon, everyone. And I hope everybody is doing well. As was mentioned, this is our second session in regards to Build America, Buy America, BABA, otherwise known as. So for those of you who were able to attend the first session, great. For those of you who were unable to, our goal here today is to give you a deeper dive into the BABA requirements. It will be interactive with knowledge checks, though we ask that you just kind of answer to yourselves. You don't need to throw it into the chat. But to the extent that you have questions, please put them in chat, and time permitting, we'll address before we get to the end of the session. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, real quick, just a quick introduction of myself. I'll introduce myself, and then I'll have my colleague Anthony say a few words as well. My name is Naveed Kashani. I'm a director in KPMG in the Government Contractor Services Group, based outside of DC. Started my career doing audits with another Big Four firm, went off to practice law for a few years, and then came back into consulting, dealing with a variety of regulations like FAR, CAS, 2 CFR 200, and now to include BEAD and domestic content regulations. Anthony, if you want to just real quickly introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, David. Hey, everyone. Anthony Amato. I'm a manager with KPMG out of our New York City office. Been with the firm for about 7 years, largely supporting state and local governments with grants management, oversight, compliance, and reporting. Really, over the past 5 years or so, I've been supporting a number of different state broadband offices with those efforts, including for ARPA and BEAD and now BABA. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, Anthony. So today's objective, we're going to start by grounding in the why. So where BABA fits in from an IJA perspective and what that means from the grants and the federal financial assistance award funds that you're using. From there, we're going to progress into the 3 BABA categories and their distinct tests and do a couple practice domestic content calculations at a very high level to help guide the way that you might start to think about some of these calculations. Next, we're going to focus on execution. So these are going to be things like documentation requirements, what to expect from suppliers, how to build a reproducible audit trail. And then finally, we'll discuss where or when exemptions or waivers may apply at a high level. At the end of this call today, our goal for you is to help prepare you understand the deeper intricacies of BABA and give you enough knowledge to be dangerous and start to take the appropriate steps towards compliance. But it's not necessarily an operational guidebook and pathway to compliance, just to keep that in mind. If we can go on to our next slide, please. One more slide, please. Thank you. So here's the 30,000-foot view of BABA as it applies to IJA and BEAD. So first and foremost, BABA is extending a domestic preference across federal financial dollars for infrastructure via grants and subawards. It got incorporated into these types of awards after May 2022. It does so through 2 CFR Part 184. And really all it does is it's pushing for the use of domestic materials and products in infrastructure projects. Under BABA, infrastructure is interpreted pretty broadly, but it's pretty clear in the regs that broadband deployment is considered part of infrastructure. But when it comes down to it, it's an incentive to strengthen domestic manufacturing push. It's nothing new that we haven't seen before. It's just related to new types of funding. And we've seen this kind of push towards domestic content regulations from this administration and the last administration. So what's the actual requirement? Well, the actual requirement is no funds for a federal financial assistance program for infrastructure may be obligated for a project unless all of the iron and steel, manufactured products, and construction materials used in the project are produced within the United States. To determine if it's produced within the United States, there's 3 buckets, 3 category tests, each with their own instructions and guidance. So starting with iron and steel on the bottom of that circle there, what is considered iron and steel under BABA? These are going to be articles, materials, or supplies that consist wholly or predominantly, which in this case means greater than 50% of iron or steel or a combination of the both. And the test you're looking at for iron and steel is that all the manufacturing processes from the initial melting stage through coating need to occur within the United States to be considered produced in the United States under BABA. Next is the one that I think a lot of people think of when they think of BABA. It's manufactured products. And I guess we should start with kind of getting a better understanding for what manufactured means. Under the guidance, I can give you the real nice legalese definition. Articles, materials, or supplies that are being processed into a specific form or shape, or they're being combined with other articles, materials, and supplies to create a product with different properties from the individual parts. That's a lot of legalese. Really what I want you to take away from that is it needs to be beyond just simple assembly. It needs to be transformative from the parts and supplies. But what's the test for these manufactured products under BABA? It's a 2-part test. It needs to be manufactured in the United States. We just touched on what that definition includes and its practical effect of looking at that analysis, right? But the second part is the cost of the components need to be greater than the 55% domestic cost, right? There is a caveat there. That's a floor, not a ceiling. So here you're dealing with a 55% threshold, but say you go into another grant or another agreement and things change with that other agency, it can exceed 55%. So remember, it's a floor, not a ceiling. And sticking with manufactured products, you might be asking, well, what constitutes costs when you're thinking about components? So there's two ways of viewing this. If your manufacturer is purchasing components, costs can include the acquisition cost, it can include the transportation costs, it can include applicable duties. But if they're making their components, then that's going to include the types of costs that are associated with manufacturing the component itself, transportation costs, and an allocable amount of overhead as well. What that does not include is profit margins and costs that are associated with the manufacturing of the actual end product itself. And the reason that's in place is because they do not want domestic content to be falsely propped up by claiming, manufacturing a product altogether has a lot more domestic costs than it really does. Last but not least, construction materials. The test here is that all manufacturing processes for construction materials need to occur within the United States. That's defined under 2 CFR Part 84 with material-specific tests. And that's going to be like things like fiber optic cable, optical fiber, so on and so forth. Now, in our last session, I asked, and this applies here too, when should you start thinking about these types of things? And the answer is now, before the procurement process. For subgrantees such as yourself, what this really boils down to is you're responsible for BABA compliance through your grant agreements. So that means you need to start thinking about classifying these items correctly and obtaining the proper supplier documentation that aligns to those category tests I just mentioned. So let's go on to our next slide, please. So our first knowledge check, again, no need to put this in chat. We'll give you a few seconds to consider. The first question is, which option correctly pairs each BABA category with its core compliance test? I'll give you a few seconds to read through the options before we go into the answer. So rather than reading through every single answer, the correct answer here is A. And why A is correct is, again, iron and steel, all manufacturing steps need to occur within the United States. Construction materials, they all must be produced within the United States per those material-specific rules we mentioned. And last but not least, manufactured products. The end product needs to be manufactured in the United States, and it needs to meet that domestic content percentage. So let's go on to our next slide, please. So I promised a couple examples, and I've got 3 for you here that we'll go through. These are high-level examples. And as we go through it, pay attention to the locations, the costs. These are the types of things you want to start to evaluate. For the first example, we have a network enclosure that's being manufactured within Ohio. There are 2 types of costs, US and foreign. We have it totaling US in $130 and the foreign cost totaling $30 for a total domestic content cost of $160. Does this meet the BABA requirements? Give it a few seconds. Next slide, please. So the answer is it's yes. It would meet the requirements under BABA. First, when you start to look at this, you need to look at what's being procured. So in this case, it's a manufactured product, which tells us that we need to abide by the 2-part step test, the 55% domestic content. So our calculation would be $130 worth of US cost over $160 total dollars, gets us to an 81%, which far exceeds our 55% threshold. And the end product itself is being manufactured within the United States. Let's move on to our second example, please. So this next product is an optical network terminal. It's being assembled in the United States, and its component costs are $120 of domestic cost and $130 of foreign costs for a total cost of $250. Does this meet BABA requirements? Okay, next slide, please. So once again, let's look at the category. We're dealing with a manufactured product here. I'm going to start with the domestic content calculation here because I think a lot of you guys probably got this right, where you said it's $120 over $250 total component cost gets you to 48%. So it fails the test for manufactured goods right off the bat there. But one consideration is, let's say you take a look at this and you decide, hey, I'm going to resource key components to be domestic, and you're actually meeting that domestic content calculation. Well, you always have to pay attention to the language. In this particular case, the product is being assembled in the United States, and assembled is different from manufactured. So even if we do meet the content test, you might still fail depending on the nature of what's being produced. Let's go on to our next slide, please. So for example, number 3, product is rebar. It's multiple jurisdictions are handling this. So melt and pour is being done in Pennsylvania. The rolling is being done in Indiana, and the coating is being done in Canada. You have about $100 of US cost and $10 of foreign cost for a total component cost of $110. Does this meet your BABA requirements? Next slide, please. The answer here is no, it doesn't. So looking at the test here, we're dealing with iron and steel. And if you can recall from before, it all needs to take place within the United States. So in this particular case, we have a foreign coating that's being applied in Canada. So it would not meet the requirements under BABA. Ways you could verify this if you were to purchase would be mill certifications and records for the melt, pour, roll, and finishing within the United States. Can we go to our next slide, please? So challenges and best practices. In this section, we're going to be discussing documentation responsibility, what you need to keep, responsible parties, flow downs, et cetera. So if we go on to our next slide, we'll start with some of the documentation responsibilities. Like when it comes down to it, BABA compliance lives and dies on what you're documenting. You're going to be doing a lot of hard work to make sure that you are compliant with BABA. But all that hard work goes to waste and it's not possible to be compliant if you can't prove it when asked. And failure to meet those documentation requirements can also result in consequences. Failure to provide that necessary documentation requested either from Colorado or a federal agency could result in violation of the terms and conditions of your actual award. And we've seen corrective actions. Like I know some of my colleagues have seen actual situations where there has been a request to remove and replace improperly purchased foreign goods. We've also seen a reduction in the amount of award or withholding of future funds. And on the more severe cases, there's been situations of terminating awards, or in cases where there's false compliance claims, then fraud and investigation and prosecution. But as we look at the stakeholders on the left here, it really roles and responsibilities are flowing from top to bottom. So federal awarding agencies like NTIA and TOC, they're going to set the policies, the requirements, and enforce. State broadband offices like Colorado are going to disperse funds and review awards from subgrantees to validate compliance. Third is y'all, the subgrantees. You are the front line, so you will need to be able to obtain and verify and organize and retain documentation from your contractors and your suppliers, and you need to be able to pull it upon request. And that brings them down to their contractors and suppliers. So that needs to be flowed down to them. They need to be aware of those requirements, and they need to be able to provide them and demonstrate it to you. Let's move on to our next slide where we discuss what those actual documents should look like. So let's translate these BABA requirements into the exact artifacts you're going to need to collect, validate, and retain. The goal here is to have a traceable, auditable thread of documentation from each installed item back to a certification or a waiver where applicable. And I think that the most important one we're going to look at here is your vendor and supplier certifications. It's critical. It's your primary proof. It's a formal certification that attests that it meets the correct BABA standard with those various tests like iron and steel 100% within the United States, so on and so forth. You're going to see that in a couple ways. Manufacturers can self-certify. More often than not, I would imagine you're going to seek these vendors and supplier certifications. And what you're going to be seeking in those is going to be, the reference to a specific BABA requirement. They need to be able to document the product name, the description, what it is and what it does, the quantity, location of manufacturing, and it needs to be signed on authorized company representative on their letterhead. Itemized bill of materials, the BOM, that's going to be important for validating your manufactured products. Having that costed BOM by country of origin. Ideally, you should have a project specific list that's going to tie your installed items to a manufacturer, a model, part number, cross-reference to your vendor supplier certification. Your purchase order and invoices should all tie in nicely with that. And then approved waiver documentation. So this is if it's applicable, if you are going down that path, which is, as we see is enforcement they're pushing for more domestic content, not less. So whether or not that's applicable is another story, but there are waivers out there as you're well aware of. But let's break this down into two parts. So if you are in the situation where you are seeking a waiver, Anthony will discuss this later, but requests to waive application of certain BABA requirements need to be in writing. And so the support you need to have is in that writing is the waiver justification type, what type of waiver you're seeking, the recipient name, award information, description of the project, location, the infrastructure involved, what's actually being sought to be waived, including the name, cost, quantity, country of origin, and why it's essential to the project, justification based on the waiver type, and why it can't be procured domestically. Second part of this is, okay, so let's say you do get a waiver. Once it is approved, you need to keep the underlying NTIA DOC determination and the underlying supporting justification for that waiver. You'll want confirmation of waiver approval before you make any procurements, and you'll want to keep track of a waiver log that ties those waivers to specific procurements that you are claiming. Last but not least, contract and bid documents. This is key. I know it's at the bottom, but best offense is a good defense. You're going to want to start with your flow downs, and the rest should fall in place when you pass these obligations down to your vendors and contractors. These are going to be things like upfront clauses that require BABA compliance, having requirements that documentation of compliance of your domestic content is a condition of your acceptance and payment, a right to audit, a right for a notice when there's substitution or changes, and the right for pre-approval before those go through, and then having remedies for yourself for non-compliance, and make sure that they also understand that they should be flowing down these clauses to their distributors and subs. Next slide, please. So when we look at this slide here, the examples that we're looking at are from NTIA guidance and show the types of documentation that you should be seeking in your manufacturer certification. And on the right-hand side, if you're documenting a waiver for finished electronics. I'm going to focus on the left hand. With the manufacturer certification, like I mentioned before, you'll want it on their letterhead. You'll want it referencing the specific BABA regulatory domestic preference situation you're dealing with, documentation on the product, location of the manufacturing, and a signature from that authorized company representative. And you'll want to maintain those throughout the course and the period of performance of the award. With that being said, I think we're moving on to the manufacturer certification side, which I think Anthony will be taking up. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. Next slide. Here we're going to get into manufacturer certifications and compliance certifications. Really, the overall information on this slide is to help you have informed decisions with your manufacturers and understand that the certifications they're supplying to you all are complete and accurate. So really, it kind of gives a 4-step process in regards to what goes into that. The first thing that your manufacturer should be doing is identifying the applicable standards. They should first determine the BABA categories that the different products fall into. So is it iron or steel, a manufactured product, or is it a construction material? The next item is conducting an internal audit or analysis. So based on the standards in number one, the manufacturer should conduct a thorough review and analysis. So for manufactured products, they should be able to trace the supply chain to determine the origin and cost of every single component that they're supplying to you. They then should be able to perform the cost calculation. So the total cost of the US components for that good divided by the total overall component cost to ensure it meets that 55% threshold that Naveed was speaking about earlier. For iron, steel, and construction materials, they also must verify and document that all manufacturing processes for the product have occurred within the US. Then creating that internal backup documentation. So again, what we kind of say in grants is if it wasn't documented, it didn't happen, right? To support that certification that they're providing, they should have internal detailed records to justify that certification. This is really that primary evidence, again, an audit trail. So in the event of a federal audit or CBO asks for these. Now, these records should include items like a lot of items Naveed shared previously, invoices and receipts for all components, traceability documents for raw materials, and records of their own manufacturing and assembly locations taking place within the US. Once that analysis is complete by your manufacturer, they can then accurately provide that certification using a template like what was shown on the previous slide. It has that manufacturer's name and address, the individual product names, model numbers being certified, also a clear statement of the products that they comply with BABA. And again, it's better to kind of have it on their letterhead and it's signed by an authorized representative of the company who's certifying that letter to you all. Again, use this as a tool as you're speaking with your suppliers and manufacturers to make sure not kind of just blindly certifying a document and sending it over to you. Next slide. Here we're kind of getting into some general compliance requirements, really how you can empower different folks within your own organization to promote BABA compliance really from the get-go and getting ahead of it early on within your respective projects. Couple different key roles we've outlined here. The first one, maybe the most important, although they're all important, is having a BABA compliance officer or a grants manager who's knowledgeable of the BABA rules and regulations governing the BEAD program. Really, they're owning all compliance efforts. This person should be responsible for all documentation, reviewing all submissions from contractors and subcontractors, and the primary point of contact in terms of working with CBO in regards to BABA compliance. The next person is your project manager or construction manager. Really, they're your eyes and ears on the ground. Their role is ensuring that what's being delivered, allocated, and applied to your project on site matches all of that supporting documentation you have in your certification letter, your bill of materials, your purchase order, and your invoices, right? They're also working directly with that BABA compliance officer to confirm compliance on the ground. And again, they're really your first line of defense, your eyes and ears. Then you have your procurement or contract manager. We'll get a little bit more into flow downs on the next slide, but they're responsible for ensuring that all your contracts and purchase orders where you're working with prime contractors or subcontractors have all of those BABA compliance items in there. They're flowing down through all the contractors in your network that you're working with on your project. Last but not least, legal counsel. They should really be consulted on any complex BABA matters, or if you have a legal specific question, don't pretend to play lawyer, right? Consult counsel if you have a question and arrive at the right decision. Next slide. Here are just some general procurement and flow down requirements that are important to have in all of your contracts, again, with your vendor network. Certainly making sure you have all of the flow downs that are in your sub-grant agreement regarding BABA that are in your agreement with CBO, but also making sure you're referencing OMB CFR Part 184, any agency or program guidance from the NTIA or CBO, and certainly 2 CFR 200. Make sure, again, it has those covered categories that we spoke about, so iron and steel, construction materials, and manufactured products. Also just required supplier deliverables. Again, these should be taking place before delivery or installation on your respective product. So that certification, again, is your primary document, but making sure for manufactured products, you have a costed bill of materials that shows domestic content percentages, evidence that it was manufactured in the US. For iron and steel, that can also be supported by mill certifications and record of melt, pour, roll, finishing, and coating within the United States. For construction materials, again, that's production evidence under OMB definitions for items such as fiber, glass, drywall, and non-ferrous metals. Also, we'll get into waivers a little bit, but if you do have a waiver and it was approved, you're tracking all the costs that are allocated to that waiver and are not exceeding the threshold or dollar amount applied to that waiver. Overall contract clauses, you do want to reserve the right to audit or inspect any records, those items that we spoke about that support a lot of those certifications. CBO will be doing, BABA compliance and monitoring, but you also want to reserve the right to do the same with your respective vendor network. Again, also making sure there's traceability matrices in terms of how different items are applied to those different categories, and also record retention, right? All these records and supporting documents need to be maintained for 3 years post closeout for the period of performance of your grant. That's really something that's important to stipulate as well. So if you're buying something within year 1, but your period of performance ends in 3 years, right, those documents will really need to be maintained for 6 years. So making sure that's also in your contracting documents as well, because if audits take place, after some of these products are built, the feds might still ask for them. And also, bid evaluation and award, right? BABA is really a pass fail, right? If they're not BABA compliant, you likely shouldn't be, awarding any contracts to any vendors unless you already have, a pre-approved waiver. Next slide. Here are just a couple additional strategies for verifying and certifying compliance. A lot of these we covered already, but again, just planning early and mapping those categories for BABA compliance is really, really important. Verifying evidence, having all of that supporting documentation. Again, I know we'll say it throughout this training, but making sure you have that audit trail to support all of your BABA compliance across those categories is paramount to validate the costs throughout the life of your program. And again, also applying risk-based checks, right? I think we spoke a lot about having, compliance at the forefront, making sure you're verifying that before any funds are spent, but also on a post-payment side, right? Things might be missed. So using a sampling approach, spot audits and checks, post-payment as well to reconfirm BABA compliance is another tool at your disposal that you should consider using. Also, just watching for some red flags that you might see in terms of interacting with vendors throughout your network or throughout this process, right? Vague or boilerplate certificates, missing supporting documentations like bills of materials, invoices, purchase orders, unwillingness to disclose plant locations to confirm that they are within the US, percentages that can't be tracked or reconciled, right? Those 3 items should really flow into each other. You have your certification, bill of materials, purchase order, invoices. You should be able to recalculate those items on your own. If they don't, tie, that's an immediate red flag as well. Also for foreign finishing items, coding steps regarding iron and steel, U.S. assembly only for manufactured products. Some of those items might be taking place outside the U.S. Those are things you want to verify and check and have in your conversations with vendors. Next slide. So here we have a couple common challenges that might take place and we want to make everyone aware of. The first thing is supply chain, right? So for certain categories, especially complex electronics or specialized components for broadband, there may be a limited number of supply, right? There's 50 states and additional US territories who are running BEAD programs at the exact same time, trying to get the exact same equipment and follow BABA. That could create potential supply chain shortages. So again, that's why it's really important now to start having conversations with your vendors to get in front of this, to get ahead of any potential market constraints, and if those are taking place, to document them and speak to your state agencies about them to make them aware of what's going on for your project. Also, just inadequate and incomplete documentation, right? Sometimes sub-grantees do struggle with paperwork, either to internal issues or as a result of the vendors that you all are working with on your projects, right? I know we covered vague certifications, but making sure they're not vague and appropriately marked up with a sufficient level of detail that Naveed shared earlier. Missing certifications or untraceable documents, those are all red flags that we covered earlier, but things you want to get ahead of, again, as you're having these conversations with folks. Also, just subcontractor and distributor management, ensuring BABA requirements are understood by folks in your network, and being aware of potential issues at the outset to understand what vendors you do or might not want to work with on your project to ensure BABA compliance throughout the program. Also, cost pressures. We're going to get into waivers in a little bit, but there is a unreasonable cost threshold, which is, it increases the total cost of your project by 25%. That is still a pretty high threshold, right? So let's say it's increasing, as a result of using domestic source products to comply with BABA, 20%, 15%, or 24%, right? You won't be eligible for a waiver, but that could, put a significant burden from a cost perspective on your project. So that creates an additional constraint. Also, just delays in general, right? Coming into compliance for BABA could take a good amount of time. Previously we kind of walked through the steps in the analysis that manufacturers should be doing to support that waiver process or certification process. That takes some time to do. But also in the event, even if you've done that analysis and you find out that some of your manufacturers cannot comply, then you have to go through the waiver process, which is also timely. And upon submitting a waiver, also takes a couple months. And also, while general awareness for BABA is growing and a lot of manufacturers and suppliers are building out their own compliance processes, it still is something that's new to them as well, which could create additional time constraints on your project. Next slide. With that, Naveed will walk us through our next knowledge check.
Yep. Thanks, Anthony. And just to add on to your last point, I mean, not only are there some manufacturers who aren't aware, but there are some who might claim made in USA, and their definition and understanding of what that means is different from what your underlying grant requirements are. So just something else to keep in mind. So we're on to our second knowledge check. This is part 1 of 2. The question here is, what are some key documents that you would use to verify, in this particular case, a manufactured product, its domestic content? Is it A, a costed BOM showing the US and foreign component split? B, marketing brochure or spec sheet? C, supplier org chart? Or D, shipping receipt? Answer here is going to be A, a costed BOM showing country of origin, aka that US and foreign split. Remember, the test requires that it's subject to both the threshold and the place of manufacturing. So the costed BOM is going to give you the underlying detail that you need to figure out the threshold test. The other documents we have outlined here, like a supplier org chart, shipping receipt might be helpful, but they're not going to substantiate BABA compliance. Let's go on to our next knowledge check, please. Now, same question, but for iron and steel products. And our options here are mill certifications that cover melt, pour, roll, and finishing coating, a made in the USA label, US shipping documents, and a purchase order. I know I mentioned this earlier, so for those of you that if your eyes haven't glazed over yet, the answer here is A, mill certifications. If you recall that all manufacturing processes for iron and steel need to occur within the United States, so your mill certs and your process records are going to be the appropriate proof. Like I mentioned before we got to these knowledge checks, some manufacturers may claim made in USA label, and that's nice and sounds great on paper, but the responsibility is still to validate what they might consider made in USA might not actually adhere to what the BABA underlying requirements are. I think if we go to our next slide, Anthony's going to be picking up on waivers.
Perfect, thank you. Next slide, please. So just general waiver authority as a high-level overview. The Department of Commerce through the NTIA is the federal administering agency for the BEAD program who has waiver authority under this. Really, it's for 3 limited circumstances that apply, which we're each going to get into detail here. There's the public interest waiver, non-availability waiver, and unreasonable cost waiver. Important to note, obtaining a waiver, item in bold there, means that a project would be permitted to use certain foreign source materials for their broadband project that would otherwise be non-compliant with BABA. Therefore, waivers should be approved prior to acquisition in order to be compliant. So don't go off and buy materials, then seek a waiver after. Go through the waiver process, and if approved, then go out and buy and purchase your materials. Next slide, please. Just to give an overview of how the waiver process would work, right? It really starts with a subgrantee preparing their justification. So this means you've done all of your market research, You determine that a waiver is needed based on that research, and you're including detailed information about the materials in question. So evidence that you've done a thorough search with suppliers and have a clear rationale for one of those 3 waiver types before submitting it up to your state broadband office and ultimately the feds. After you've done that market analysis and research, have it thoroughly documented, all your communication, you'll then submit it to your respective state broadband office, in this case a CBO, who will review it and then determine its sufficiency and accuracy. Based on their review, they'll then submit it on your behalf to the Department of Commerce. At that point, the Department of Commerce will then receive it, conduct an initial review, ensure the justification is sound and that it has all information and supporting documentation. If they approve it beyond that point, it'll then be posted publicly within the Federal Register for public comment, which typically lasts for about 15 days. The purpose of this is it allows other stakeholders and domestic manufacturers to submit comments or evidence challenging the basis of the waiver. So, for example, if you say that a domestic alternative isn't available, they might comment and say it is. And if the Department of Commerce validates that, then your waiver will be disallowed. After that public comment period, what the Department of Commerce does, they review all comments in consultation with the White House Made in America office, who really oversees BABA across all federal agencies, and they will then make a formal decision of yes or no. If yes, keep that waiver for your supporting documentation. And again, track all of the costs you are allocating to that waiver because it will have a specified amount. Next slide. So here, the first one we have is the non-availability waiver. What this waiver means is that it can be granted when there is specific iron, steel, manufactured products, or construction materials needed for a project that cannot be produced in the U.S. in sufficient and reasonably available quantities or of quality. So again, getting into these 2 main items, it has to do with quantities and quality. As it relates to quantities, this means that a domestic supplier cannot produce the required amount of the item within your project's timeline. So for example, let's say you have 10,000 units of a fiber optic connector you need by June, but based on your market analysis and research and interactions with vendors, all domestic suppliers combined can only produce 2,000 units by the date you need it. You would then apply that non-availability waiver, could be justified potentially for 8,000 units. When you're looking at quality, this applies to domestically produced items, but it does not meet the necessary technical specifications or quality standards for a project. So for example, here you must provide clear evidence to support that quality claim. So engineering reports, spec sheets demonstrating why the domestic product is unsuitable for its intended use within your network. Key components of this waiver is making sure, again, you have that audit trail and have done your due diligence so you can support your claim. So again, that market research, evidence of a thorough search across the domestic marketplace. That means you've had multiple conversations with multiple vendors, trade associations, et cetera, and you have that documented, whether that's through emails, texts, call logs, meetings, meeting notes. But you need to be able to show the federal government that you've had these conversations and also the responses from these other suppliers that these items are not available domestically or cannot meet the quality standards. One item we just want to call out, I know we covered it in our previous training, but the Department of Commerce has already issued a limited general applicability non-availability waiver for BABA requirements for certain construction materials and manufactured products, and this is for non-optic glass inputs and electronics and BEAD programs with exception, and this is posted on the NTIA's website. Next slide. Next, we have the unreasonable cost waiver. Here, it's really important to call out the definition of unreasonable. It's not subjective. So under IJA, and what this means for BABA is there's a clear benchmark and it would decrease the total cost of your broadband project by more than 25% of the total project cost, not a single component cost of your project. Through here, this can really be calculated by 2 scenarios. So scenario A, cost of the foreign item. First, you want to be able to calculate the total estimated cost for the entire project, assuming you are using a cheaper, non-compliant foreign source item. Then in scenario B, you want to recalculate the total estimated cost for the entire project, this time substituting the compliant domestic source item. So here's an example. A waiver can be justified if the total cost of scenario B is greater than 1 1/4 the cost of scenario A. So let's say you're planning a rural broadband project, for example. The total cost with foreign components of scenario A for the entire project using some non-domestic components is $2 million. The total cost with domestic components, scenario B, sourced with BABA compliant materials is $2.6 million. Here, some simple math, the cost increase is $600,000 or 30% of that $2 million. So because that 30% threshold is greater than that 25% increase for your total 25% project cost, a waiver could apply here. Important to note though, again, what's bolded on the bottom there, to substantiate this waiver, the application would need to include all your quotes, bids, financial estimates to arrive at these calculations. So again, having that audit trail and supporting documentation to submit to the DOC when applying to these waivers is key. Next slide, please. The next waiver here is the public interest waiver, and this one's a little bit different. So unlike non-availability or unreasonable costs, which are based on quantitative tests, the public interest waiver is based more so on a qualitative assessment. What this means is a public interest waiver can be granted when the DOC determines that applying BABA domestic content preference would be inconsistent with the public interest. This means the entity requesting the waiver as a subgrantee must demonstrate that there's actual harm to the public from enforcing BABA standards on a project. For this waiver, it's important to note there's no exhaustive list in terms of what might be public interest, but here are some representative examples which might apply across a couple of different broadband projects. The first example here is, significant delays to your broadband project. So for example, if you're only using domestic project or products, this may cause a major delay on a broadband project that may deprive folks or a community of essential connectivity for an extended period of time. Here, a potential public interest case may be made. The argument really is that the public's interest or need for timely internet access outweighs the benefit of domestic sourcing. The same can be said with any international trade agreements in place. If there are international trade agreements for certain goods or components, the U.S. may not want to violate those to comply with BABA. So here, a waiver may be granted to ensure compliance with these international agreements. Also, if there's a potential emergency or disaster situation, right, our broadband network needs to be repaired or built in response to a natural disaster, a waiver could also potentially be justified to help restore or build critical communication services. Next slide, please. Here we also have the de minimis waiver. This is a blanket public interest waiver issued by the NTIA for the BEAD program. What it does is it acknowledges that it's not practical or in the public interest to track and source a domestic alternative for every single low-value component in a large infrastructure project. This does have a cap on it, so here a subgrantee can use non-compliant manufactured products as long as the total cost does not exceed the lesser of $1 million or 5% of your total project costs. Again, when utilizing this waiver, it's incredibly important to track the cost that you're allocating to this. So here we just have a couple examples. So for a $10 million project, the cap would be $500,000 since 5% is less than $1 million. But if you have a $40 million broadband project, the cap would be $1 million since that is less than the 5% value of $2 million. Again, it's a pre-approved exemption. There's nothing you need to submit to the NTIA, but keep detailed records of how you are allocating costs and applying this waiver throughout your project. You cannot exceed it. It's important to note that the waiver also cannot be used on certain items. This includes optical fiber and fiber optic cable, also specialized electronics such as optical line terminals, OLT line cards, optic pluggables, optical network terminals, and optical network units, also for all enclosures such as cabinets, vaults, and pedestals. Next slide, please. Here's just kind of an overall waiver, summary comparison chart. For you all, as you're thinking through different waivers, a couple questions to ask yourself if you're considering how a waiver might apply to you. So non-availability waiver, the required product is not produced in the US for the necessary quantity or quality. The key question to ask yourselves after a thorough market research, can this item be sourced domestically and meet your project specifications and timelines? Primary evidence you should actually support this is your market research, cost documentation, and your good faith effort to find these items. So again, those call logs, emails, communications you have with your vendor network. The unreasonable cost waiver, again, you're thinking through the cost of using the domestic product to make the entire project excessively expensive, right? Meeting that 25% threshold. So does the domestic item increase the total project cost, not a component cost, of more than 25%? Here, the main source of documentation is that financial analysis to prove that it exceeds that 25% threshold. Last but not least, applying the public interest waiver. Applying the BABA rule would be contrary to the public's best interest. So is there a compelling reason why enforcing BABA might harm the public good more than it helps? So a well-reasoned argument that supports it by data or how you're tracking and applying that de minimis waiver. Next slide. And here we won't go through this chart, but it's really just meant to, as a left behind, it's a resource for you all when we send out these slides, but it goes through the different cost categories, a couple of different items from a materials perspective, how that applies to BABA, if that can be used for the de minimis waiver, and the rules you should all follow for your respective projects. So definitely take a look at this to go along with those questions we just went through following this presentation. Next slide. So here we have our next knowledge check. The question is, a BEAD subgrantee is building a fiber network. They find that using a required BABA compliant electronic component will raise the total project cost from $1 million to $1.3 million. Under which BABA waiver could the subgrantee most likely apply? For this one, the correct answer is C, the unreasonable cost waiver, because the total project cost increased by more than 25%. With that, to go through the FAQs, Naveed, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Anthony. We can go to our next slide, please. So these are some frequently asked questions that we've seen both in industry and through NTIA guidance. We'll start with our first question. If most of your project is BABA compliant, but a small portion is not, can a funding recipient self-fund, that is to say, pay with non-federal dollars for the non-compliant products? Unfortunately, the answer here is no. Under BABA, the Build America, Buy America preference is going to apply to the entire infrastructure project. That's even if it's being funded by both federal and non-federal funds under one or more awards. So unfortunately, that's not a workaround. It does require you to abide by it for the entire agreement. Our second question is, do the tools and equipments used to perform construction activities for a BEAD project need to be BABA compliant? Answer here is no, they are not required to be BABA compliant. OMB actually issued out a memo in 2023 addressing this concern. When you think about the BABA domestic preference requirement, it's applying to things that are like articles and materials and supplies that are being consumed and incorporated into affixed into a federal infrastructure project. So as a result, it's not going to apply to these tools. Question 3, do BABA requirements flow down to subrecipients and so on and so forth? Answer is yes, they do. These requirements, all infrastructure projects that are going to be funded by the BEAD program, either directly or indirectly, must comply with BABA. So it flows down to subrecipients, subgrantees like yourself, and then subsequently, you should be flowing these down. It's your responsibility to make sure that you include these BABA requirements and terms and conditions to your contractors and vendors and your sub-awards and subrecipients. So refer to 2 CFR 184.4 if you want more information around that. Question number 4, for the purposes of the BEAD program, what does it mean to be a manufactured product produced within the United States. A lot of the same words, so I can see how it could be confusing. Really, it just comes back to referred to CFR Part 184. It lays out the groundwork for you. Just remember that under BABA, all iron and steel and manufactured products and construction materials need to be produced in the U.S. Produced in the U.S. is your test, right? And what produced in the U.S. means is going to be dependent on the category you're dealing with. So for manufactured products, it's going to be manufactured in the United States, not assembled, and the component test that we've discussed. And go on to our next slide, please. Will software R&D costs or labor costs count in calculating the cost of components for a manufactured product? Answer here is no. Keep in mind though, like for the BEAD BABA waivers, the software integration, things like firmware integration, licensed software, customer specific configurations are some of the processes that need to be conducted entirely within the United States for those certain electronics to be considered produced in the United States. Question 2, can you buy equipment or materials from China? This one's interesting. So this is referring to AIJA as a whole, right? And I'll spare you the whole clause reading. It's section 60102G1. It basically says, though, in layman's terms, the subgrantee can't use the funds to purchase and support fiber optic cable and optical transmission equipment manufactured from China. That rule is going to apply notwithstanding any waiver of the BABA rules. And then there are additional prohibitions on certain covered telecommunications and video surveillance services that you'll also see in 2 CFR 200, section 216. Last question here. If a recipient like Colorado or so on and so forth received the waiver on behalf of a subrecipient for a specific manufactured product, is that manufactured product waived for all BEAD subrecipients? Your answer here is it depends. So as waiver requests go to NTIA, they can grant either a project-specific waiver or a program-wide waiver. We've seen one of those program-wide waivers. That's the general applicability one that Anthony brought up. If NTIA is granting a project-specific waiver for a product under BABA, then that product would not be considered waived for all BEAD subrecipients, only the one that's being named and received in the waiver itself. With that being said, we can go on to our next slide where Anthony will conclude and take it away for us.
Perfect. Next slide, please. Here we just have a couple key takeaways for you to leave with before ending this training. First thing, just to recap, know your categories and rules, right? BABA compliance hinges on correctly categorizing every single purchase item on your project, which we understand can be difficult to do. So understand how that applies to the 3 main cost categories regarding iron and steel, construction materials, and manufactured products. Also, understand how waivers work, right? As we went through all of those 3 examples. Not all products have the same requirements under BEAD due to the different waivers issued. So make sure you get ahead of those and understand those and how a waiver might apply or not apply to your respective project. Documentation, this might be arguably the most important one, is proof of compliance, right? Create a clear, auditable trail for all your BABA covered items on your project throughout the period of performance, right? Failing to maintain proper records is a major material compliance risk. You want to have all those documentations regarding the manufacturer certification, bill of materials, purchase orders, invoices, and also if you're supporting any waivers, having the documentation to support that waiver justification, also having the waiver itself. And again, also for the actual de minimis waiver, if you're applying that, tracking all the costs that you're applying to that threshold. Again, number 4, integrating BABA from day 1 into your project and organization. Proactive procurement is a tool, making sure you have those appropriate flow downs in your contracts and subcontracts. Begin to establish, a BABA compliance governance model, making sure you have assigned roles and responsibilities. And again, that you're getting in front of us and talking to your suppliers and manufacturer network. Again, going back to waivers, there's a high bar and threshold. The level of detail that you need to provide, right? Showing that you've done that market research and had those conversations and justifications, and again, supporting documentation. So again, if a waiver is something you think might apply, make sure you've done that analysis and can accurately support it. And again, just the last one to reemphasize, assigning those roles and responsibilities throughout your organization and on your projects, making sure there's folks on your team who've read through the BABA guidance provided by the NTIA, are knowledgeable of it, can have, intelligent conversations with your manufacturers and suppliers so all your projects are compliant with BABA and there are no issues. I think with that, on the next slide, I know we're a couple minutes over, but here's just some resources and links for you all to view on your own time if you want to read through. And the next slide, I don't know if we have time for questions, but Colorado team, if we want to open up the door or answer any after the fact, we're certainly happy to through additional FAQs.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. I think we could stay on and do a couple more minutes of questions if we want. So it looks like we've got a few coming in to the chat. Could vendor supplier rather than sub-grantee apply for a waiver? Anthony, Naveed, does that question make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. Sorry, I was on mute and didn't realize it.
No problem.
I think this is the type of situation where our recommendation is, as you start to go through your supply chain and deal with your vendors and see whether or not they are able to or unable to be compliant with this, if they are able to demonstrate to you that there's maybe a potential compelling reason, and you work with them and you submit on their behalf to kind of help this go through, right? I think it's more compelling and works with the state agencies to get it out through NTIA. It also gives you the opportunity to start to see where some of the weaknesses are in your supply chain. And if vendors are starting to say, hey, we can't do this, but we want a waiver, well, there are going to be potentially other solutions for you to identify, whether it's manufacturers who have self-certified. There is contact information to kind of help find vendors that can comply with BABA requirements under the DOC website. So my recommendation is they value industry's perspective on this. Y'all as sub-grantees are going to be the best voice to work with Colorado to get those waiver requests out there.
Okay, we've got two more questions in the chat and then we'll close things out. So the next question, can you clarify the expectations for electronics, networking gear, routers, switches, etc.? Brian, I think, are you asking just how to clarify how it's categorized? I don't know if I follow the question.
Hey, John. Hey, yeah, no, I just, it's my understanding that there's a blanket exception for things like routers and switches and so forth. So just if Naveed or Anthony can clarify that.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull up the specific content under the DOC general applicability. If it's considered, I think, a finished electronic, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm not a network engineer, an expert in that. I can get you a more detailed take on this, but my understanding is if it's not fitting in those 4 or 5 categories that Anthony outlined as not waived, then it should be applicable to the general waiver that was set out there. But we'll circle back on that and be sure to get you the more detailed answer after this call.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Okay, last question. Will there be a statewide BABA waiver for fiber? I ask because MAS is looking into fiber waivers for the state. That's an interesting question. Naveed, Anthony, have you heard anything like that? I've not.
I have not in the other states that we're partnering with or working with. I think that'd probably be something states might take into consultation if they're hearing something similar from a lot of their project partners. But I have not heard about anything yet, but definitely something we'll keep an eye on, I think, and obviously collaborate with you all on should there be anything.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks everyone. We're a few minutes over, but I want to thank our colleagues, Naveed and Anthony, for their time and expertise on this subject. It was a lot of information. I know, keep in mind, folks, this was recorded. It will be posted on the BEAD landing page that was linked in the chat earlier. So please come back and revisit this as needed. Next week, come with your questions. We didn't have a lot of time for questions this week. We do take those back and put into our Q&A every week and try to keep that updated. But next week, we're going to make a lot more time for answering questions. I think we were primarily going to just make space for questions next time. So if you've got burning questions, things that are still causing stress, bring those next week to us, and we'll try to answer those on the call. With that, thanks again, everyone, for your time, especially staying a few minutes late. Hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.